Good day to everyone. My name is K.S. Mathew, a professor in the Department of Computer Science, Rajagiri School of Engineering and Technology, Kochi. Welcome to Module 5 of course CS 308, Software Engineering and Project Management, 6th semester BTech Computer Science of Kerala Technological University, Trivandrum. Module 5 includes two main topics, project risk management and software maintenance. Today in this session, I am going to discuss on project risk management. So these are the subtopics we are going to discuss in project risk management. So we'll start with defining risk and what are the project risk and what is risk management and what are the different processes coming under project risk management, like risk identification, risk analysis and prioritization, risk management planning, risk resolution, and risk tracking and control. So what are risks? So I will use an analogy to discuss the risk management aspect. I will take a small general project, a vacation to Bali, Indonesia, island in Indonesia. Do you think it is a project? Yes, if you consider the various aspects of this particular activity of a vacation to Bali, you can see that it has all the characteristics of a project. So I will take this project to discuss various aspects of project risk management. So I will give examples of this project to make the concept clear. So when you consider this project of vacation with your family to Indonesia, a Bali island, you will knowingly or unknowingly think about various risks that can happen in this vacation project. And you will identify, you may not document it, but you will really look at various possible risks in this project and plan actions to mitigate the risk in this project. So in any project, in software project, there are many risks. If it is a small project, the number of risks may be less, but if it's a very large and complex project, there could be hundreds of risks. In any project, there will be some risk. So as part of project management, it is the responsibility of a project manager to identify all the risk in a project and take actions to mitigate the consequence or negative impact of the risk in your project goals or project objectives. That is what is done in project risk management. Let us look at the definition of risk. Risks are those events or conditions which may happen or may not happen, and if it happens, there is a negative or harmful impact on project objectives. So that is what is defined as project risk. So it is an uncertain event. It may happen or it may not happen. So there is a probability associated with occurring of risk events. And if it occurs, there is a negative consequence on the project objective. So when you hear the term risk, there is a negative connotation. So there is a problem, there is an issue. That's what comes into your mind. Now, so as I said, a project risk will also have an associated probability because it may not always happen. It is not certain, it is uncertain event. So the probability may vary between 0 and 1. And it is a possibility of a problem, but it is not certain. So at this point, it has not yet happened. It is going to, you are anticipating that problem in future. So now you have an opportunity to take action to either eliminate the risk completely or mitigate the impact of the risk, and so that you can make your project successful. That is what is done as part of project management. And if you don't address the risk and don't attack the risk, risk will come back and attack you and your project will fail. Now, if you look at the project risk management definition, Project Management Institute USA, you will see a slightly different definition. So this is the definition of project risk as per Project Management Institute USA. Project risk is an uncertain event or condition that it occurs as a negative or a positive effect on a project objective. So as per PMI, it could be an event which may also have a positive impact on your project objective. So as a project manager, your job is to take actions to eliminate or mitigate the events that may have a negative impact or take actions to enhance the opportunity that can happen because of an event that may have a positive impact on your project objective. So you need to consider both these events which will have a negative impact as well as a positive impact, and plan actions to eliminate or mitigate the consequence of negative events as well as enhance the occurrence of positive events. That is what is done as part of project risk management. Now let us look at what is risk management. Project risk management is one of the knowledge area of 10 knowledge areas in project management as per PMI's Project Management Body of Knowledge 6th edition, which was published in 2017. So it is a set of processes with methods and tools and techniques to identify the risk, analyze the risk, and manage the risk impact. If you consider the project risk management processes, it can be classified into two components. The first component is called risk assessment. So in this part of risk management, we will be identifying various possible risks in the project, analyzing the risk so that we can prioritize the risk in terms of the severity of the risk in the project objective, and then prioritize the risk based on the impact and the probability. That is what is done in the first part of risk management, that is called risk assessment. The second part is called risk control. Here we will try to plan actions for all the identified and prioritized risk and trigger that action, so initiate that action whenever the risk is going to happen in the project. And as part of your project status and progress monitoring, you will also monitor those identified risks and reassess and reanalyze and reprioritize and look for the symptoms of those risks and trigger actions whenever you find some such symptoms occurring in the project. That is what is done in risk control. Now, going forward, we will be discussing various processes that comes under these two components of risk assessment and risk control one by one in detail with various tools and techniques for those processes. So these are the two components in the project risk management. Now let us look at what are the various processes coming under risk assessment. The first process is risk identification. So we need to identify, as part of project initiation and project planning, all the possible risks that can happen in your project. There are various tools and techniques which we are going to discuss. And the second process is risk analysis. Once you have identified the risk, it is you need to analyze this risk in terms of its probability and impact and prioritize the risk. Why we need to prioritize? Because as I said in the beginning, there could be hundreds of risks in a project. It is not practical or we don't have enough time and resources to address and manage all the 100 risks. It is not practical. So we need to prioritize the risk in terms of the negative impact that risk is going to have in your project and address only the top priority risk. Plan actions for only the top priority risk. We will document all the low priority risk and keep it as a watch list, and we may not plan actions for those low priority risks. That's the reason why we need to analyze and prioritize the risk, because there could be hundreds of risks in a project. That's the second process in risk assessment, under risk assessment. And the third process is risk prioritization. Based on the analysis of the risk, based on the probability of occurrence and the impact of the risk in the project, we will quantitatively give a score for each risk identified, and based on the score, we will be prioritizing the risk and identifying the top priority risk. And in the second component of risk control, we will plan actions. So let us look at what are the processes coming under risk control. The first process in risk control is risk response planning. So all the identified risk, we will plan some actions to eliminate the risk or to mitigate the impact of the risk in the project. That is what is done in risk response planning. And then as part of your project status and progress monitoring, we will be looking for the symptoms of the risk occurring in the project and initiate actions which you have planned as part of risk response planning by the risk owner. There will be a risk owner identified for every risk as part of risk identification as well as risk response planning, and that person is responsible for initiating the actions planned whenever he or she sees a symptom of the risk going to happen in the project. That is what is done in risk resolution. We will look at what are the resolution options a project manager can have in order to address various risks in the project. And the third process coming under risk control is risk tracking and control. So as I said, as part of your project status and progress monitoring every week, you should also include risk reviews and track and monitor all the identified risk, and analyze, reassess the priority and update the priority in the risk register. And you may, as part of that, you may also identify some new risks which was not originally identified as part of your project initiation and planning. So you may update the priority of the risk, you may identify a new risk, and you may also find that some of the risks which you have identified in the beginning based on some assumptions are no longer a risk, because as you progress in the project, you may get a lot of information about the project. Initially, you may have only limited information. You may take some assumptions because of lack of information and plan your project and go ahead. Once you take an assumption, there is a possibility that assumptions may go wrong. And if assumptions go wrong, the plans you have prepared based on the assumptions will also go wrong. That may lead to a risk. So you will identify a risk corresponding to each of the assumptions you have taken. So as we progress in the project, you may get more details, and you find that assumptions you have taken are valid, may be valid. So the risk related to the assumptions can be completely removed from the list. So you may also retire a risk or remove a risk from the list. That is what is happening in the risk tracking and control. You should also report the risk management status to the top management and the customer as part of your project status and the progress reporting. So if you look at the overall process flow, this is how it looks like. The first process is identifying the risk in the project, identify all the possible risk in the project, and the output from this process will be a risk register, risk statements, or a risk register, which may be a simple Excel sheet where you will list out all the possible risk in the project. And once you have the risk register as output of risk identification, you will analyze that or each and every identified risk based on mainly two factors. There are different factors, but primarily people consider two main factors like probability of the risk as well as the impact of the risk. Based on that, risk will be analyzed and a risk score will be calculated. Based on the risk score, risk will be prioritized in a low priority risk, medium priority risk, and a high priority risk. And you will have a list of top priority risk. And then once you have the list of prioritized risk, you will plan actions for mitigating or eliminating the risks which are of high priority. That is what is done in risk resolution planning. And then after that, you keep on tracking or monitor the risks identified as part of your weekly project status and progress monitoring, and reanalyze the risk, reassess the risk, reprioritize the risk. You may also identify a new risk. You may remove a risk from the list because it may not be a risk, no longer a risk. All this will happen as part of your tracking. Then if you find the symptom of a risk going to happen in the project, the risk owner or the responsible person who is supposed to address the risk has to initiate the action plan so that you can control the impact of that risk in the project. That is what is done as part of control risk. So you can see all these processes are iterative, done continuously throughout the project from beginning till end of the project. Probably every week as part of your project status and monitoring, all these processes will happen. Normally the identification will be happening in the initial stage of project initiation as well as planning, but you can also identify the project as we progress in the project, because one risk which was not identified in the beginning may be identified later in the process, later when you progress in the project. So all these processes will be iterative and which will be done throughout the project from beginning till end of the project. So this is the overall view of the processes in risk management. Now let us look at various processes, 6 processes in detail, and see what are the tools and techniques for those processes. The first process is risk identification. The primary goal of this process is to identify all the possible risks in a project and document them. So you will identify all the possible risks and document those list of risks in a document called a risk register. And you will document various characteristics of each and every identified risk. So you will have a description of the risk. You will also document which are the areas that risk is going to have an impact on, like whether the risk is going to have an impact on your schedule, on the budget, on the quality of your product, or on the resources. So there will be different areas which will get affected because of a risk. So that will be identified in the affected areas, and you will also assign a person called the risk owner who is responsible for taking action to mitigate or eliminate the risk in the project. So that is what is done in risk identification. The output from this process is a risk register. So when you try to identify the risk, you need to consider various areas in the project. There are various sources of risk in a project. So the sources can be classified into 4 categories. The first category is called technical risk. So in a project, there could be a lot of risks which are related to technical aspect of the project, like requirements. Lack of clarity in the requirement may lead to a risk. Frequent changes in the requirement during the project is another risk. So requirement related risk can be identified. And then there could be risk related to technology. You may be using an immature technology, a new technology, which is having a problem which is not mature. Because of that, it may lead to a risk in the project. Changes in technology during the project. You started with one version of, say, .NET platform, and during the project, Microsoft has come up with a new version of the Microsoft .NET, and the customer wanted to use that new version. When you start using that new version, you find that there is a lot of inherent bug in the new version, which will lead to a risk in the project. So you need to manage those risks as well. So there could be a lot of risks related to technology, and there could be risk related to performance and reliability requirements stated by the customer. Some of the performance requirements, like response time, throughput from the application, may not be possible or achievable with the current technology. So you may identify that as a risk, a performance and reliability requirement which is not achievable with the present technology could be identified as a risk. Quality related risk, again the performance requirements, so quality requirements stated by the customer may not be practical. So there could be performance issues, there could be quality issues in terms of defect density. So you need to identify the risk related to quality requirements stated by the customer and the top management. So these are the various subcategories of risk coming under the major category called technical risk. Then there are risks related to project management. So one of the main risks that can happen in project management related area is incorrect estimation of size, effort, and cost of the project. Many times the companies may not have a proper methodology or technique for a software estimation, and that will result in an incorrect estimation, and that will lead to a risk in the project like schedule slippage, overrunning the budget. All that problems will come if the estimate is not correct. And lack of proper communication between the stakeholders, with the team and the top management, with the team and the customer, that can also lead to a failure of the project. And there are a lot of other issues that can come because of project management related issues, like poor allocation of time and resources for various tasks, poor quality of project plan. If some projects may not even have a proper plan made by the project manager, that will lead to the project failure. And poor use of PM disciplines, PM methodology, or the processes in the organization is not adequate for a proper project management. That can also lead to a risk in the project. So third category of risk is organizational risk. Every organization has some constraints and limitations. Because of that, there could be risk coming to your project. One of the risks related to organization is dependency risk. Your project may be depending on one deliverable from another project running in the organization or a deliverable from another department. So if there is a delay in that deliverable, your project schedule will get slipped. So that is the dependency related risk. Then resources are very limited in every organization. There could be some highly skilled resources who are shared across multiple projects, and normally the resources are not owned by the project manager, they are owned by functional managers. And for a project manager, his or her project is of high priority, but for a functional manager who is providing resources for various projects, the priority could be different. So he may have a project which is having high priority than your project as far as he is concerned. So he may be providing that highly skilled resources to another project, and you may have problem in getting that highly skilled resources for your project. So there could be a risk related to conflict of resources in the project. Also, there could be labor issues that comes in between the project that may also lead to a risk. And funding, interruption of funding or lack of funding or reduction of funding for your project, that may lead to another risk. If there is a change in the management, top management of the customer organization, they may also have a reprioritization of their project, and your project may be given a low priority, and that may result in interruption of funding or reduction of funding. That will lead to a risk in your project. So lack of prioritization of your project may lead to another risk, which is organizational risk. Then there are fourth category or fourth source of risk called external risk. Many of these external risks you may not have any control over, but you need to identify those risks as well, and you need to plan contingency reserve for managing those risks which you don't have any control over. Third party related risks. Your project may have subcontractors, suppliers, and you may be using third party components, and if the deliverable from a supplier or subcontractor is delayed, that may lead to a schedule slippage in your project, a risk in your project. Similarly, you may be using some third party components. If there is a quality issue in that third party component, that can lead to an issue in your project or risk in your project. And regulatory changes in the regulatory environment. Rules and regulations of the government can change during the project. That may also lead to a risk in your project. For example, suppose you are developing a point of sale application or an e-commerce application. Suddenly, government is coming up with a change in the tax rules, and the product functionality may also get affected, because you need to include the GST and the tax component when you when you invoice the product, for example. So there may be a change in the process of calculating tax when there is a change in the tax rules by the government and regulations, on which you don't have any control at all. And changes in the market environment may also lead to a risk. You have initiated this project by seeing an opportunity in the market for your product, but when you are in the middle of the project, you find that the demand for that product in the market has come down because of another solution for the same problem. So that will have an impact in your project objective, project output. That will lead to a risk in your project. And changes in the customer top management can result in changing in the priority of the project, and it may lead to lack of funding, interruption of funding, reduction of funding, etc. And you may have risk in your project because of changes in the top management of the customer. There are a lot of factors in the environment in which you run the project, which can also have an impact or risk in your project. Some of the environmental factors, like political scenario in a country where you do the project. If there is a political turmoil in the country where you do the project, that can lead to a risk in your project. Economical downturn of the world can also result in a risk in the project. And there are risks related to force majeure, like weather changes, natural calamities like earthquake, cyclone, tsunami, epidemic like Nipah virus and coronavirus and COVID-19, etc., can also result in a risk in your project. So you need to identify a risk in various sources or various categories of various areas of your project and have a risk register. Now let us go back to the analogy, the hypothetical project, a vacation to Bali Island. So what are the possible risks you could identify in that Bali vacation project. You may identify, before going knowingly or unknowingly, you will take a lot of medicines. Like so you may be having fever or headache when you go there. For that, you may consider some tablets or some medicines which will help you to reduce that problem. You may also take a health insurance, international travel insurance, to take care of hospitalization. If you fall sick, you may have to get hospitalized, and there is a cost risk involved. In order to address the cost risk, you may take a travel insurance. You may be robbed, your purse may be lost, your documents may be lost. So you may also consider some actions to mitigate those type of risk. So knowingly or unknowingly, you will consider and identify all the possible risk in that vacation project. That is your personal small project. So even for that project, if you are going to identify and take actions to mitigate the risk, definitely a software project which is going to have hundreds of risks, definitely you need to have a proper risk identification and planning for managing that risk in the project. So this is if you put those 4 categories of risk or 4 sources of risk as a hierarchical chart or a tree structure chart, it will look like this. So you will have all subcategories, 4 major categories: technical, external, organizational, and project management. Under that, you have subcategories like requirement, technology, complexity, interfaces. And under project management, you have estimation risk, planning risk, controlling risk, etc. So this is called a risk breakdown structure, or RBS. This can be used as a tool for risk identification. You can look at these subcategories and ask yourself whether there is any risk for your project related to this category or not. That way you can identify the risk in your project. So RBS is a tool which can be used for risk identification. And what are the top 10 risks in software projects in general? So there is a person called by name Pankaj Jalothe. He was the vice president of Infosys for many years in development, and later he moved to Dean in IIIT New Delhi. Now he is a director of IIIT New Delhi. He has written a book on software project management. In that book, he has identified top 10 software project risks based on his experience with Infosys projects. Now he says that these are the top common risks which can happen in any software project in any organization. Now let's look at what are those top 10 risks in software project. The first risk he has identified is shortage of technically trained manpower. This is a common risk faced by all organizations. Too many requirement changes. Unclear requirements. Many times software project requirements will be very vague, incomplete, and not clear in the beginning of the project. That may lead to a risk. Manpower attrition. That is also a common problem in the IT industry. People leave the organization and go to another organization during a project. So if the project leader leaves the project in the middle of the project, you will have a problem in the project. So manpower attrition is a common problem. Externally driven decision forced on the project. Top management and the customer may force to agree on a shorter schedule for your project. That may lead to a risk in the project. Not meeting performance requirements. Performance requirements and reliability requirements stated by the customer may not be practical in the current technological scenario, for example. Unrealistic schedules forced on the team by the top management as well as the customer. Working on new technology, hardware and the software, which is not stable, which is not mature, will lead to a risk in the project. Insufficient business knowledge. This is also a common problem in IT industry. IT industry, the resources are mainly engineers, BTech graduates. They may not have domain knowledge in the business domain in which they do the project. They may be doing a banking project, but the resources or developers may not have an experience in the banking domain. That will lead to risk in the project. Incorrect estimates of effort, cost, and schedule. This is related to project management. If the organization doesn't have a proper estimation technology, estimation technique or methodology, that may lead to incorrect estimation of effort, cost, and schedule, and which will lead to a risk in your project. So these are the top 10 risks in many software projects. And at the end of this session, we will also look at what are the mitigation actions suggested by Pankaj Jalothe for managing this top 10 risks. based on his experience in Infosys. So what are the other tools and the techniques for risk identification? So documentation reviews. So you may have a lot of documents like project plan, software requirement specification, design document. In all these documents, you may document something called assumptions and constraints. So if you analyze these assumptions and constraints, you will be able to identify a risk which is related to an assumption. If the assumptions go wrong, that may lead to a risk. That way you can identify risk by reviewing the documents. You can also look at the databases, various databases available in the organization, historical databases available in the organization like process database, project database, risk databases of previous project, which will help you to identify risk in your project. And you can play a lot of information gathering techniques like brainstorming. You can have a brainstorming with subject matter experts and senior members of your team, which will help you to identify a lot of risk. Delphi technique is also again expert judgment or expert opinion. You can have input from your experts or subject matter experts and senior members of your own team and use something called Delphi technique for identifying the risk. You can also interview key stakeholders of the customer and key team members to identify the risk. You can also do a SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunities and threat analysis. You can look at the strengths and weakness of the organization and the project and which will help you to identify the weaknesses. You identify the organization and the project will help you to identify some risk which is related to that weakness. Similarly, you can look at the opportunities and threat in the market, which will help you to identify some risk. So you can do a SWOT analysis which will help you to identify risk in your project. You can also have a checklist prepared based on whatever risk happened in the previous project. Use this checklist. Checklist is a list of questions. You will have a lot of questions. You answer that question which will lead to identification of risk. Then assumption analysis, which we already talked about, document reviews, and you can also have some diagramming techniques, diagrams for identifying risk, like cause and effect diagram or fishbone diagram. So risk, as we discussed in the beginning, all risk will have some cause and a consequence, or a cause and effect. So which can be diagrammatically represented using fishbone diagram, which will help you to identify the risk related to various causes of problems you have identified in the fishbone diagram. Similarly, you can prepare a flow chart of your business process which you are going to automate, and you will be able to identify, by looking at this process flow chart, you will be able to identify the flows in the process or defects in the process which may lead to a risk. That way we can identify the risk. And there is the type of diagram called influence diagram, which depicts various factors in the environment that is going to have an influence in the output or the project objective. So that will help you to identify risk related to some of the environmental factors that may have an influence in your project outcome. The second process is risk analysis and prioritization. Once you have the list of risk, there could be hundreds of risks in a project, and it is not practical. You don't have enough time and resources to address all the 100 risks. So it is necessary that you need to prioritize the risk and address only the top priority ones and keep the low priority ones as a watch list. And that's the reason why I need to go for risk analysis and prioritization. Normally, people use two factors of the risk for analyzing the risk and assessing the risk severity and prioritizing them. So one is probability of occurrence of the risk. So risk is an uncertain event. So there is a probability associated with risk. So you will consider the probability of occurrence as one factor for analyzing and prioritization. The second factor, impact of the risk in the project outcome or objective. What is the amount at stake in the project if that risk is going to happen? These are the two main factors normally people consider in order to analyze and prioritize the risk. And based on these two factors, you need to calculate something called risk exposure or risk score, which is a simple multiplication of probability and impact. Probability may be scored in a scale of 0 to 1. 0 means not at all. 1 means there is a certainty of risk happening. So probability may be scored in a scale of 0 to 1, and the impact may be scored in a scale of 1 to 10. And you multiply these two factors, you get a figure called risk exposure or risk score. And based on this figure, you sort the list of risk in the descending order of the risk exposure or risk score, and then you get the top priority risk at on top of that list. That's how you analyze and prioritize the risk. Another tool which is commonly used for risk analysis and prioritization is called probability impact matrix, which is a table like this, which is a fixed table, which you can use to analyze and prioritize the risk. In the x-axis, you have the impact of the risk on the project in a qualitative scale like very low, low, medium, high, and very high. And in the y-axis, you have probability of occurrence. It is again scored in a qualitative scale of very low, low, medium, high, and very high. And there is a number given for each score, and based on this number, in the intersecting cell, there is risk score, which is the multiplication of probability and impact. You have a number here, which is fixed. So look at the risk list and take each risk and assess the probability and impact on a qualitative scale, very low, low, medium, and high, very high, and very high. And if you assess the probability of a risk as medium, for example, take this row, and if the impact is assessed as high, take this cell, which is intersection of probability medium and impact high, you get the number here 0.2, that is the risk score. Similarly, take the next risk, assess the probability and impact in the qualitative scale of very low to very high, and suppose the probability is assessed as low and the impact is assessed as medium, you have this number 0.06 as the risk score. So use this table to identify the risk score, and then you sort the list of risk in the descending order of risk score, which will help you to identify the top priority risk. So that's how you prioritize. And you remember to reanalyze and reprioritize periodically, probably every week as part of your project status and progress monitoring, because the probability and impact may change for a risk as we progress in the project. Probability of occurrence may come down, the impact may come down. For some of the risk, impact may go up, probability may also go up. So you need to reanalyze and reprioritize the risk as we progress in the project as part of your project status and monitoring every week. And there are some other tools which are also used, commonly used for risk analysis. FMEA, the failure mode effect analysis, is a very common tool used for risk analysis. The speciality of this tool is like it uses a third factor of risk called detectability in order to prioritize the risk. So in the previous example, we have seen two factors, probability and impact. So it considers probability and impact plus an additional factor called detectability to analyze the risk and prioritize the risk. So we'll see a sample of FMEA sheet, and if it is a very small sample, 10 risk in a small project, so there is no need of going for a comprehensive risk analysis and prioritization process. You can plan action for all these 10 risks, and you can manage the risk using a simple Excel-based tracking sheet, a risk tracking sheet. So in the FMEA, failure mode effect analysis, as we said, risk as a potential failure mode. Failure mode are the risk. And if the risk occurs, there is an effect of the failure. And effect is assessed in, effect is called as severity of the risk, which is scored in a scale of 1 to 10. And for every risk, there is a cause and mechanism of failure, and there is a probability of occurrence of that cause. And probability may be scored in a scale of 1 to 10 again. And 1 means low priority, 10 means high priority, severity low means 1, severity high means 10. And the third factor is detectability, which is also scored in a scale of 1 to 10, but in the reverse order. If there are some risks which is not detectable, risk may happen, but there will not be any symptom at all. That is very critical. It is very risky because you will not see the occurrence of the risk, and you will not be able to plan and initiate actions. So that is more risky for a project. So if the detectability is low, it is scored as 10. If the detectability is high, it is scored as 1. So it is in the reverse order. The other two is in the normal order. And once you have this, you will calculate a number called risk priority number, which is the multiplication of these three factors: severity of occurrence, severity of the risk, probability of occurrence multiplied by detectability of the occurrence. So you will get a number between 1 and 1000. If all the three factors are 1, you will get an RPN of 1. If all the factors are scored as 10, you will get a number of RPN of 1000. So the RPN number will vary between 1 and 1000. Then you can sort the risk list in the descending order of RPN number, which will help you to identify the top priority risk. Then you will plan actions for all the top priority risks, assign a risk owner or a person who is responsible for triggering the actions in case the risk occurs in the project, and you also suggest a target date for taking the action. And that is how the FMEA is used in risk analysis and prioritization. So there is a sample FMEA tool which can be used, Excel-based simple tool, which can be used to apply the FMEA technique for risk analysis. So in the first column, you have the process and requirement, which is related to the specific risk. Potential failure mode, which is nothing but the risk that is schedule slippage may happen because of this. And potential effect of failure, if there is a schedule slippage, what is the consequence? Customer may be dissatisfied. And what is the possible cause for this risk? All members are first time to .NET technology. So using a new technology, that's the cause of this particular risk. And you have scored the severity of the risk in a scale of 1 to 10, and the score is given as 4 here, the medium severity. Probability of occurrence is again scored in a scale of 1 to 10, 4 score is given here. There is a subjectivity based on the person who is going to score, but still it will help you to identify and analyze the risk. And what is the existing process control for mitigating the risk? Use expert help in relevant areas, that is the existing technology, existing mechanism to control the risk. And detectability is again scored in a scale of 1 to 10, and a score of 5 is given here. And then based on this severity, occurrence and detectability, you will calculate the risk priority number by multiplying severity with occurrence plus detectability. 4 into 4, 16 multiplied by 5, 80 is the RPN number. And what is the recommended action? Give training on .NET to the team members. So this is the RPN number. Like that, you can again, the next row will have the next risk. So you will again calculate the RPN number. Based on the RPN number, you can prioritize the risk by sorting this list in the descending order of RPN number. Then plan actions for all the top priority risk. If it is a small, simple project, and with only less number of risks, like 10 risks, you need not go for a comprehensive risk analysis and prioritization. You can have a simple Excel sheet like this and try to plan action for all the 10 risks and track the risk using this simple tracking sheet. You list out all the risks in the small project, maybe 10 risks, then plan action for all these 10 risks, assign a responsible person or risk owner for each of the risks. Risk responsible person could be different for different risks, because a risk related to a project management area may be addressed by one person. A risk related to a technology area may be addressed by another person. So risk owner could be different for different risks. And due date can be given, and actually a completion date when the action was taken, that date can be updated here, and the status of the risk can also be updated as the last column in this simple tracking sheet. And when you analyze and prioritize the risk, you should also consider, we have considered 3 factors primarily in the previous slides: probability of occurrence, the impact of the risk in the project, and the detectability. These are the 3 factors we considered in the previous tools we discussed. But we should also consider something called risk tolerance of the stakeholder. Tolerance tolerance level of a stakeholder for a risk could be different for different stakeholders or individuals. So individuals can be classified into 3 categories based on the tolerance of risk. So there are people who are called risk averse people, who are basically safe players, who doesn't like to take risk. So if a person is risk averse, he doesn't like to take risk, a major stakeholder of the customer, he may be risk averse. So a risk which may have a schedule impact in your project, for the organization there will be a control limit for the schedule variance, like plus or minus 5%. That indicates a project, if you can complete the project within a variance of plus or minus 5%, not more than that, your project will be considered as on schedule, right? But for a customer, that variance may not be tolerable. So he may not even tolerate a 1 day slippage in the project. So you need to consider his tolerance level also when you prioritize. It is not the organization's tolerance level, you should also consider the major stakeholders' tolerance level when you prioritize the risk. So there may be people who are called risk seeking, there are people who are risk takers, and then there are neutral people. So you need to consider the individual tolerance level of stakeholders for analyzing and prioritizing the risk. And there are also other factors which can be considered for while analyzing and prioritizing the risk. So we have seen only 3 factors in the previous tools, like probability, impact, and the detectability. There are some other factors as well you can consider if you want to address those factors as well. Like one of the factors is called urgency. How urgent it is to take an action once a risk occurs. That is the time gap between the occurrence of the risk and the action taken. So if the time available for you to take action once the risk occurs is long time, then it is less critical. If the time available from the occurrence of the risk to the action taken is very less, it is a critical risk, right? So the urgency is very high if the time is very short for you to take action. Then the second factor is called proximity. How soon the risk is going to occur in the project? How near the risk is from the current time. So if the time between the current time and the occurrence of the risk is very short, proximity is high. Then dormancy. Some of the risk, even if it happens, you will not see any symptom. It will remain dormant. You will not be able to identify that the risk has already happened. So that is a highly risky situation if there is no symptom of risk happening. So if the dormancy period is long, dormancy is very high. If the dormancy period is less, dormancy is low. And dormancy period, if it is very high, it is a highly critical situation. You will come to know about the risk only after a long time. And another factor is manageability. How easy for the risk owner to manage the risk. And controllability. How easy for the risk owner to take action to control, mitigate or eliminate the risk. Controllability of the risk. Whether is it possible to control the risk, whether it is possible to reduce the impact and the probability, or whether it is possible to avoid the risk. Depending on the difficulty of control in the risk, you will score this factor in a scale of say 1 to 10, controllability. Detectability we already talked about. And connectivity. One risk may be related to or connected to a different other risk. So if that one risk occurs, there is a possibility that other risks will also occur in the project. So if there are large number of risks which are related to a risk, connectivity is high. If there are no risk related to a particular risk, connectivity is very low. So connectivity is high means that there are a lot of related risks which may happen if the main risk occurs in the project. Then strategic impact. Majority of the risks will have an impact on your project objective, but some of the risks may also have an impact on the strategic goal of the organization. So you need to look at the impact of the risk and see whether that impact is going to have an effect in the strategic goal of the organization, and based on that you can prioritize the risk. And the last factor is called propinquity. That is how relevant this particular risk is for the stakeholder. Some of the risks stakeholders may not be very much concerned about, so it is not at all relevant for the stakeholder. Some of the risks the stakeholders may be very much concerned about, so it is highly relevant for the stakeholder. Depending on how relevant the risk is to the stakeholder, you may score this factor of propinquity in a scale of say 1 to 10. So that way we can prioritize and analyze the risk. Now the last process is risk control. So the primary goal of this process is to reduce the probability of occurrence and reduce the magnitude of loss, or reduce the impact and change the consequence of the risk. That is the main goal of this process of risk control. And what are the different processes under risk control? Risk response planning, risk resolution, and risk tracking and control. So in the previous set of processes of risk assessment, we have identified all risk and we have analyzed and prioritized risk. So you have a prioritized list of risk at this point of time. Now the next step is to plan actions for each of the identified risks and which are of high priority. So these are the questions to be answered while planning for risk responses. What is the risk? Where and when might the risk occur? Identify the triggers and symptoms of each risk. Who is responsible for managing the risk? Identify the risk owner. How to manage, how to mitigate the risk. What are the options available for project manager to mitigate the risk, to either eliminate the risk or reduce the impact and the probability of the risk? How will the risk be handled if it occurs, and have a contingency plan? And when to retire the risk, when to remove the risk from the list. So all these are the questions to be answered while you plan your risk responses. So it is the process of developing various options and determining actions to enhance the opportunities in case of uncertain events that may have a positive impact, and reduce the threats for events that may have a negative impact in the project objective. So what are the various resolution approaches we can adapt for managing the risk? So there are 5 different approaches we can adapt for managing the risk. The first approach is called avoidance. If at all possible, try to change your plan so that you can eliminate the risk completely. It is not practical or possible to eliminate all the risk in a project. There could be some risk which could be avoided by changing your project plan. For example, in one of your projects, there is a component for developing a highly complex algorithm for production scheduling, for example. And you don't have the expertise for developing that algorithm, and you have identified that as a risk in your project. Project was initially planned to be completed, executed in-house, so you have identified this particular component for which you don't have the expertise. That is identified as a risk. And when you did the research, you find that there is an expert available in IIM Kozhikode who can help you to develop that algorithm. So then you change your plan to outsource this particular algorithm component to IIM Kozhikode. That way we can avoid this risk of not having expertise to develop that algorithm. That is one way of avoidance, which is not practical for all the type of risk. And the second approach is called transference or deflection. Here, the approach is like we are trying to transfer the consequence to a third party or to one side of the one stakeholder. Taking an insurance. So when you go to Bali vacation, you may take an international travel insurance to address the risk of falling sick or getting hospitalized. So you are actually transferring the cost risk. You may still fall sick, but you cannot avoid that. But you can transfer the cost risk to the insurance company. So that is one way of transferring the risk to another party. So by having a specific type of contract, you can also transfer the risk to either the customer or to the supplier. For example, normally you have a product warranty. For example, whenever you buy a product, you get a warranty. Even for software products, you will get warranty. Whenever you deliver a product, you give a warranty to the customer saying that for the next 6 months, all the defect reported will be fixed free of cost at the supplier premises. So the supplier is going to take the risk of defect detected during the next 6 months. So actually the customer is transferring the risk to the supplier, right? So that way we can transfer the consequence to one party. That approach is called transference or deflection. Insurance, performance bonds, warranties, guarantees, use of fixed price contract. So there are different types of contract. When you use a fixed price contract, the supplier will get, customer has to pay the supplier a fixed amount. Even if the project cost exceeds, customer is not worried about that. It's a fixed price contract. So actually the overrunning the price of the product or the cost, the risk is the customer is transferring that risk to the supplier by signing a fixed price contract. And the fourth common technique adapted is called mitigation. Here we are not eliminating risk completely. We are trying to take some action which will reduce the probability of occurrence and which will reduce the impact of the risk in the project. So we will plan actions which will reduce the probability or the consequence of the adverse risk event to the acceptable level, like reducing the complexity of the design, conducting more tests. Suppose there is a performance requirement stated by the customer which is not very practical to achieve, you have identified it as a risk. So in order to ensure that you are meeting the performance requirement, you may plan some additional performance test to mitigate that risk. So you may also have a third-party supplier or a contractor for doing some work, and there is a risk identified in case the deliverable from the supplier is late. That may also have an impact in your schedule. So choosing a more stable vendor will be an approach to reduce the impact or reduce the probability of occurrence of that event. Then the fifth approach is called acceptance. Acceptance. So some of the risks which you will not have any control, for example, external risk, force majeure, natural calamity, you don't have any control over. You cannot plan any actions at all. And some cases, planning action or taking action will cost more than the impact. So you will not plan anything. And also there are some risks which are low priority risk. You will not plan any action in advance. You will keep it as a watch list and accept the consequence as it is, right? And you will plan some contingency reserve in terms of additional time or buffer time and buffer budget to address those risks which are accepted, either because it is you don't have control over and you cannot plan anything to control that, or it is of low priority and which you accept. And also after taking some mitigation steps, you will not completely eliminate that risk. You will only reduce the probability and reduce the impact, but still some risk will be remaining. That is called residual risk, and that will be normally accepted by the management. And for addressing that residual risk also, you will also plan contingency reserve. And if the contingency plans doesn't work, you will also have a plan B, which is called fallback plan, in case the contingency plan doesn't work for all those accepted risks. And the last approach is called escalate. And you can escalate a risk to a stakeholder, a top stakeholder, who is concerned with the project objective being affected by that particular risk, if that risk control is out of project team's control. If project team is not able to control a particular risk, it is out of control of project team, that risk can be escalated to a stakeholder who is concerned with that with the project objective that is being affected because of this risk. So once you escalate, you will update the status of the risk as escalated, and after that you don't have to do any action with respect to that particular risk which is escalated. So we'll look at some other terms. Residual risk. Residual risks are the risk that remains after taking actions like avoidance, mitigation, and transfer, right? So you may take a travel insurance when you go to Bali vacation. So insurance will also have a limit. You will not get unlimited amount for even if you get hospitalized. There is a limit. So if the expense go beyond that, there is again a risk. That is up to the limit, the insurance company will bear that cost, but over that limit, you have to bear that. So that is called residual risk. Risk that remains after taking avoidance, transfer, and mitigation action is called residual risk. There are something called secondary risk. So when you take an action for a particular risk, when it occurs, that action itself will trigger another risk. For example, we talked about avoiding the risk of developing the highly complex scheduling algorithm. You have decided to outsource that particular component development to IAM Kozhikode, and that risk will be eliminated. But because of outsourcing, you may have other risk, like if there is a delay in delivery from IAM Kozhikode for that component, then your schedule will also get slipped. So you will identify the risk because of the action taken for managing one risk. So that is called secondary risk. Consider the Bali vacation. You have identified that in the beginning you have identified that there is a possibility of chickenpox in Indonesia when you go there. And in order to eliminate the risk, you have taken a vaccine before going there. So that is an action for eliminating the risk of getting chickenpox. So chickenpox may not come. But when you go there after taking this vaccine, you find that there is an allergy developed because of this vaccine, which is a secondary risk. Now contingency reserve. Contingency reserve, which I already talked about, for all the accepted risks. Some of the risks you cannot do any action because of the cost involved. For example, weather conditions. tsunami, you will not be able to plan any action, right? Those risks you will be accepting the risk as it is. And for addressing such risks, you will have a contingency time or additional budget kept for that. That is called contingency reserve, and which is normally kept within the budget of the project. And hence, the project manager will have the authority to utilize the contingency reserve if that contingency situation arises in the project. And risks are normally known as unknowns. Risks are uncertain events or unknowns. Risks which are already identified are called known unknowns. Some of the risks which are already identified, you are not taking any action, you are accepting it, either because it is of low priority or because you cannot take any action, or taking action will cost more than the impact, then you accept that. For all the accepted risks which are identified at the project level, and the project manager has the authority to utilize that contingency reserve. And there is another reserve called management reserve, which is normally kept at the organization level for all the projects in the organization, which are normally for the risks which are called unknown unknowns. Risks are normally unknowns. Some of the risks which you have not identified a risk, but it can happen. A risk which is not at all identified in the risk can happen in the project, which are called unknown unknowns. If such type of risk occurs in the project, you can utilize the management reserve. But it is outside, it is not kept at the project level in the project within the project budget, it is at the organization level. So the project manager will not have the authority to utilize the management reserve. He has to get the approval from the management to utilize the management reserve. Now let us look at the top 10 risks which is given by Pankaj Jalothe as part of his experience in Infosys projects. And let us look at what are the mitigation steps he suggests for those top 10 risks in software project. Shortage of technically trained manpower. What are the mitigation steps suggested by practiced by Infosys and suggested by Pankaj Jalothe? Make estimates with a little allowance for initial learning time whenever you don't have enough technically trained resources. Maintain buffers of extra resources if practical. Define project-specific training program. You need to plan training for project resources depending on where the skill is lacking. Conduct course training sessions within the team. One team member who is an expert in the back end can give training for other members who are not familiar with the back-end programming, for example. Similarly, a developer who is expert in the front-end development can train back-end developers in developing front-end programs. That way they can cross-train the resources, which will help in mitigating this risk. Too many requirement changes. Obtain sign-off for the initial requirement specification from the client. After making the SRS, get it signed off by the client. Convince the client that changes in requirement will affect the schedule. So you need to convince the client whenever they come back with a change in requirement, you need to convince the client how it is going to affect your schedule and the cost. Define a procedure to handle the requirement changes. In the organization, there should be a properly defined process to manage changes in the project requirements. So you need to apply those procedures whenever there is a change in the project requirement. Negotiate payment on actual effort. You can also have a contract on time and material basis in order to avoid or mitigate this requirement changes. When there is a contract based on time and material, customer has to pay on actual effort. So if the actual effort is going to increase, definitely they will try to reduce the requirement changes. Unclear requirements. So this is also a common problem. So what are the mitigation steps? Use experience and logic to make some assumptions and document the assumptions and keep the client informed. And obtain the sign-off of requirements and assumptions. Develop a prototype and have the prototype reviewed by the client, which will help you to make the requirements clear. Manpower attrition. The project team members may leave the organization during the project. That will result in a risk. So what are the actions we can plan in order to mitigate this manpower attrition risk? Ensure that the multiple resources are assigned on key project areas. For key components in the project, assign multiple responsible persons so that even if one person leaves the organization, we have another person to take over. Pair programming is a technique followed in agile practices where two programmers sit in front of one computer and do programming. So that way you are training two resources on the same program. So even if one person leaves the organization, there is another developer who is familiar with the same code, he can continue maintaining that program. And have team building sessions. Organize team building sessions as part of your project as well as organization. If the team is motivated, the attrition level will naturally come down. So having a motivated team is a mechanism to reduce attrition. So plan team building sessions frequently within the project. Rotate job roles among team members. You give opportunity for various team members to take up some roles on a rotation basis. For example, meeting convener role can be rotated, Scrum Master role can be rotated. So when you rotate this role, people get motivated. They get an opportunity to experience or learn some new role, right? So that way people get more job satisfaction, they will not leave the organization. Keep extra resources in the project as backup if possible. Maintain proper documentation of each individual's work. That is also very much essential. If there is no documentation of the work done by individuals and the individuals leave the organization, it will be very difficult to maintain that work done by that individual. But if there is proper documentation maintained within the project, even if one person leaves, we can get another resource to maintain a code by looking at the documentation. And follow the configuration management process and guidelines strictly. Configuration management, version control systems. There are a lot of tools which is used for version control. If you don't maintain the versions properly, there is a big problem if one person leaves the organization. So if you have proper configuration management process followed in the organization, even if the team members leave, you will be able to get the latest source from the configuration management systems and maintain it further by another resource. External driven decision forced on the project. That is another problem which can be there in a software project. And what are the mitigation steps suggested by Pankaj Jalute based on his experience in Infosys? Outline disadvantages with supporting facts and data and negotiate with the top management on who is responsible for forcing decisions. So you need to go to the person who is forcing decisions and try to convince him with the proper information and data and tell him that if you are going to force this decision, these are the risks that is going to happen in the project. And even after doing that, if it is not possible to convince him and you need to accept that decision, then identify the actual risk that can happen because of that forced decision and manage the risk. Not meeting performance requirements. Some of the performance requirements stated by the customer is not practical or not achievable in the current technology, using the current technology. In that case, what are the mitigation steps we can follow? Define the performance criteria clearly and have them reviewed by the client. You need to document the performance criteria clearly, otherwise there will be confusion on the performance criteria when you are going to get the acceptance of your product. So you need to document the performance criteria very clearly and get it reviewed by the client and get it signed off by the client. Define standards to be followed to meet the performance criteria. Suppose there is a performance requirement on the response time or the throughput. When you design your system, you need to use the appropriate methodology or design techniques in order to improve the performance of your system or reduce the complexity of your design so that the performance will improve. So define standards to be followed in the project while in the design phase in order to meet the performance criteria. Prepare design to meet the performance criteria and review it. Simulate or prototype performance of critical transactions. If the performance criteria is related to a particular component, before going ahead with the development, you can have a proof of concept or a prototype or simulate that particular module in a simulation environment and test the performance before actually going ahead with the development. That will help you to reduce the risk related to the performance. And test with a representative volume of data wherever possible. Normally the performance reduces when the volume of data increases. So you need to plan for testing with appropriate volume of data to ensure that your system will meet appropriate performance. And conduct stress tests wherever possible. Similarly, the performance will come down as the number of transactions increases, number of users increases. So you need to have a plan for doing a stress test by increasing the number of users, simulating the number of users and increase it continuously, gradually. And also increase the number of transactions that hits the system continuously using simulation tools. There are tools available for doing that. You need to plan stress test in order to mitigate the risk related to performance. Unrealistic schedule forced on the project team. So what are the actions? Negotiate for a better schedule with the top management and the customer. Identify parallel tasks and try to fast track. So there could be some tasks which can be done parallelly. Ideally, it should be done sequentially, but if required, we can do it parallelly. So identify such tasks and try to fast track the project that will advance the end date of the project. Have resources ready early. Try to plan to get the resources in the appropriate time frame when they are required for the project. So if the resources are not available in the right time of the project, that will also result in a schedule slippage. So try to plan for getting the resources in the right time frame in the project. Identify areas that can be automated. Some of the tasks can be automated so that the time taken to do that task can be reduced. That way you can compress the schedule and avoid the schedule slippages in the project when there is an unrealistic schedule forced on the team. If the critical path is, even after doing all these activities, if the critical path is still not within the agreed schedule with the customer, negotiate with the client and say we will not be able to complete the project within the schedule because it is a forced schedule and you need to get additional time for completing the project. Negotiate payment on actual effort. That is also another mechanism we can adapt to avoid the forcing of schedule on the project team. So when the customer has a contract, when the project is having a contract with the customer on paying on actual effort and time, normally they will try to avoid the changes in the requirements. Normally the changes in the requirement will also have an impact on the schedule, and you can avoid the changes in the requirements by having a time and material type of contract. And working on new technology, hardware and the software. The environment is new or immature or not stable. That will result in a lot of risk. Consider phased delivery. In that approach, the best approach that can be followed for software development is iterative approach. So in the first iteration, you will consider developing the most critical components, and during that first iteration, you will resolve all the issues related to the new technology or unfamiliar technology or immature technology, unstable technology. All the problems can be resolved in the first iteration. Then you can take up other iterations and complete the project without much problem. Begin with the delivery of critical modules. Include time in the schedule for a learning curve. Whenever you use a new technology, always estimate, when you do the estimation, try to include some additional buffer time for taking care of the learning curve, which is required for learning the new technology. Provide training in the new technology for the team. So whenever you work on a new technology, software and hardware environment, you need to plan for training to the team. That is another way to mitigate that risk. Develop a proof of concept application, which will also help in avoiding risk related to new technology. When you are planning to use a new technology or tool, before going ahead with developing the actual application, try to do a POC and see whether your application can be developed using this new technology, whether it will work. So POC can be developed to mitigate the risk involved in using new technology. Insufficient business knowledge, which is another major problem in every project. Increase the interaction with the client, ensure adequate knowledge transfer. So many team members may not have the domain knowledge. So you need to have increased interaction, you need to have regular interaction with the client and ensure that adequate knowledge transfer is made by the client to the team. Organize domain knowledge training conducted by the client people for the project team. Simulate or prototype the business transaction for the client and get it approved. You can also prototype some of the transactions, business transaction, and show the prototype to the client, get it reviewed, and based on that you can get the clarity on the business domain knowledge. Incorrect estimates of effort, cost, and schedule. This is a project management related risk. Use standard estimation techniques. Many organizations may not have standard estimation techniques, skills for doing standard estimation techniques. So they may be using expert judgment, which is the most unrealistic way of doing estimation. So train resources, train team members on doing appropriate formal estimation techniques, which will help in getting accurate estimation. Re-estimate at the end of every phase. So it is not enough to estimate at the beginning of the project. You need to re-estimate the project in every phase, at the end of every phase, after SRS, after design, after coding. So there will be variations definitely when you go on re-estimating, and whenever there is a variation in the re-estimation, negotiate re-estimated effort, cost and time with the top management and the client. Negotiate for time and material type of contract. So whenever there is a change in the estimation as we progress in the project, it is always better to have a time and material type of contract, so there will not be any problem of cost overrunning. Customer will be paying you paying based on the actual effort and time spent by the team. So these are the different mitigation steps you can apply in case of the top 10 software project risk. The last process is risk tracking and control. The main aim of this process is keeping track of the identified risk. You have already identified the list of risks. You need to keep track this risk or monitor the risk continuously as part of your project progress and status monitoring. Identifying the new risk, you will also identify new risk as part of risk tracking during the project status and progress review, because one of the risks you may not have identified in the beginning, which may be identified during the project. Monitoring the residual risk, even after taking mitigation steps or avoidance steps or transfer steps, still there will be some risk remaining. So monitor those residual risks, accept those risks and plan contingency plan. Have a contingency plan to address the residual risks which are accepted. And also ensure that risk owner is executing or initiating the action plan for the risk whenever it occurs in the project. And you should also evaluate the effectiveness of the action taken after executing a resolution action when the risk occurs. Whether the action was effective in reducing the risk, that has to be analyzed. Develop and maintain top 10 risk. Monitor these risks. Review and update each week as part of your project progress and status monitoring. Reassess, reanalyze and reprioritize the risk. Identify new risk. And some of the risks may not be a risk after some time. When you get some more information about the project, some of the risks which was identified based on some assumptions taken may no longer be a risk in the project. Those risks can be removed from the list. That is what is called a retire risk. So you need to act on the risk management plan made, discuss in regular project meetings. Status report should also, project status report should also include the status of the risk management actions taken. And track whether those who are supposed to track the risk, like risk owner, is actually watching for the risk symptoms and taking actions whenever the risk occurs in the project. And evaluate mitigation and contingency plan. Analyze the effectiveness of the actions taken. Conduct postmortems. At the end of the project, you usually need to do some postmortem analysis or causal analysis whenever the risk occurs, and see and document the lessons learned in the project in terms of risk management. And don't be afraid to discuss the risk openly. Whenever the risk is known to others, it will be very easy for managing the risk, because you will get a lot of input from your own team members on how to manage those risks. What are the tools and techniques we can use for risk tracking and control? Project risk response audit. As part of your project quality audit, you need to also review the risk management activities in the project, which will help you to track and control the risk management aspects. Periodic project risk reviews. As part of your project status and progress review every week, you should also review all the identified risks and make necessary changes in the priority as well as the action whenever required. Earned value analysis is a technique normally used for calculating the schedule variance and the cost variance while monitoring the project. So which will help you to see what is the schedule variance and the cost variance at this point of time. So which will help you to identify whether there is a schedule risk or the cost risk going to happen in the project. So then you can trigger the actions planned for that particular risk for schedule variance and the cost variance. So earned value analysis will also act as a tool and technique for triggering actions planned for some of the risk. Technical performance measurements. You can also do periodic technical performance measurement in terms of performance of some of the critical components of your product to see whether you are able to meet the performance requirements stated by the customer. If you see a problem in the performance, you will be able to trigger actions which was planned for mitigating that risk. And you can also plan some additional response plans during the project status and progress review. As we progress in the project which was not planned before, you can add additional plans in order to mitigate the risk in the project. So now we'll look at some of the cues based on whatever we covered during this 1 hour. All of the following are factors in the assessment of project risk except option A, risk events, option B, risk probability, option C, amount at stake, option D is insurance premium, are used for analyzing and assessing the risk event, risk probability and amount at stake. But insurance premium is not one of the factors which is used for assessing the risk. So the right answer is option D, insurance premium, which is a resolution action. Insurance is a mechanism to transfer the risk. So insurance premium is part of that resolution action. It is not used for assessing the project risk. Which of the following risk events is most likely to interfere with attaining project schedule objective? Option A, delays in obtaining required approvals. Option B, substantial increases in the cost of purchased materials. Contract disputes that generate claims for increased payments. Slippage of the planned post-implementation review meeting. So you can take an approach of eliminating the options in order to reach the answer. So the question is, which of the following risk events is most likely to interfere with project schedule objective? Option A, delays in obtaining required approvals. So if you are dependent on a third party to get an approval to start some work, if there is a delay in getting that approval, your work will also get slipped. So that will impact the schedule of your project. So the right answer for this question is option A. All the other options are not at all relevant with respect to the schedule objective. If a risk has a 20% chance of happening in a given month and the project is expected to last for 5 months, what is the probability that the risk event will occur during the 4th month of the project? So risk has a 20% chance of happening in a given month. Project is going to run for 5 months. What is the probability of the risk during the 4th month? That is the question. Option A, less than 1%, 20%, 60%, and 80%. So if the risk is having a 20% chance in every month, it is going to have the same percentage. So the answer is 20%. Question number 4. Most of the risk will be identified during which risk management processes? Option A, perform quantitative risk analysis and identify risk. Option B, identify risk and control risk. Option C, perform qualitative risk analysis and control risk. Option D, identify risk and perform qualitative risk analysis. So here also we can do elimination of options to arrive at the answer. So wherever you can see the qualitative risk analysis, risk analysis. While doing risk analysis, we are only analyzing the already identified risk. We will not be identifying any new risk. So these are the 3 options that can be eliminated because of this risk analysis that comes as an option. So this is the only option which during which the risk will be identified. Identify risk and control risk. While monitoring the risk already identified, you may also identify a new risk. So that is what is done in control risk or tracking risk. During that time also, we can identify new risk. So the right answer is option B. Question number 5. What should be done with risk on watch list? We already talked about the watch list. So risks which are of low priority will be kept in something called a watch list, for which we may not plan any actions, and we will keep on monitoring that. So let us look at the options given. Document them for historical use on other projects. Document them and revisit during project monitoring and controlling. Option C, document them and set them aside because they are already covered in your contingency plans. Option D, document them and give them to the customer. So as we discussed before, the risk on the watch list will be monitored as part of your project status and progress monitoring regularly every week. So document them, you will document them and revisit during project monitoring and controlling and reprioritize them. Sometimes the priority may go up, so then it will come in the top priority list and you will plan actions for that. So that is what is done in the case of watch list. Question number 6, all of the following are always input to the risk management process except option A, historical information, B, lessons learned, option C, work breakdown structure, and D, project status reports. The question is about always inputs to the risk management process. You can see this is an output. Project status report is an output. So that will not become an input. So in the report also we will have the status of risk management activities as one of the information in the project status report. So this will not come as an input. So this is the option. Option D is the answer. All the other things can be used as input for risk management process, and D is an output which will not come as an input. So the answer is option D. Question number 7, risk tolerances are determined in order to help the project team rank the project list. Option B, the project manager estimate the project. Option C, the team schedule the project. Option D, management know how other managers will act on the project. So risk tolerance are the individual's capability to tolerate a particular risk. So you need to consider that while analyzing and prioritizing the risk. So the right option is option A, team rank the project risk. So the risk tolerance of a stakeholder also has to be considered while ranking the project risk or prioritizing the project risk. So the right answer is option A. Question number 8, purchasing insurance is best considered as an example of risk mitigation, risk transfer, risk acceptance, and risk avoidance. So taking insurance is a way of transferring the cost risk to a third party insurance company. So the right answer is transfer. It is actually you are transferring the cost risk to a third party by taking insurance. So the right answer is option B. So references I have used for preparing this presentation are the book on software project management by Pankaj Jalute, Pearson edition, 2005 edition. Pankaj Jalute was a vice president in Infosys, as I said before, and he has written this book based on his practical experience doing software projects in Infosys. And most of the contents are from this book. And I have also referred PMBOK, Project Management Body of Knowledge, 6th edition, Project Management Institute USA, 2017 edition. Thank you all. We'll meet again with next module, software maintenance.